Okay, so you should now see my presentation. I want to talk about global safety standards and how to use them to get the best from your PPE. So there's basically 4 points to the agenda. I'm going to give a little introduction, which is essentially about what a crazy world we live in. And then I'm going to look at 2 types of standards. Standards for chemical protective clothing, which I've got 30 years of experience of, and then standards for FR workwear, which I've got a little bit less experience of. But even so, I think it's a useful exercise to do that, looking at both European and US standards and how they can both be useful. And then finally, I'll finish with what I see as a bit of a new approach that we could all start to take towards standards and how they can be useful in getting the best protection for workers. So let's begin. What a crazy world we live in. It really is a mad world. If I'd stood here 2 years ago and told you what was going to happen in 3-4 months' time, that the economies of the world would largely shut down, that whole populations would be essentially locked up under house arrest, shops, banks, restaurants, well, not banks, but shops, bars, and restaurants would be closed forcibly. Liberal democratic governments would be introducing new laws that gave them control over the behavior in individuals that haven't been seen for centuries, possibly. If I said that 2 years ago, you just said I was crazy, you said I was mad, bonkers, but no, it happened and we're still not fully out of it. So it's a mad world, and not quite the same level of craziness, but when you think about it, it's getting there, is the situation we have with standards for PPE around the world. So we've got various standards in North America. We've obviously got EN standards, CE marking in Europe. We've got standards in Russia. We've got ISO standards, of course, and in various other parts of the world, they pick standards depending on the product and where they are. And it's all a bit of a mess. And if you think about it, does the fact that you have different standards in North America and Europe mean that the hydrochloric acid that you need splash protection against in Delaware is different to the hydrochloric acid that you need splash protection against in Sydney, Australia? No, it's the same hydrochloric acid. Or does it mean that the heat protection that you need from a blast furnace is different in Mexico than it is in Beijing? No, of course not. It's the same heat resistance. So it's not really logical that we have all these different standards around the world. It doesn't make any sense, really. But that's where we are. And it has consequences. So one of the odd things about disposable protective clothing, which I've been involved in for a long time, is that in North America, it's the fact that most coveralls sold are sold without a hood. And yet in Europe, pretty much all coveralls sold are with a hood. There's all sorts of reasons for that, convention, but also the standards have an effect, and it can result, different standards can result in different products used for the same thing in different parts of the world. So it's crazy, really, because the protection is the same. But maybe there's a way we can take advantage of that. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to start by asking 3 basic questions about PPE. And the first one might seem fairly obvious, but it's worth stressing. That is this: what is PPE for? Say, the answer might seem obvious, but it's worth stressing because, and actually the PPE regulation 2016-425, which is the overall document that governs all the standards for PPE in the EN standards, puts it quite explicitly. It says this: Category 3 PPE, and Category 3 PPE is basically the type of PPE that protects against hazards, and it's most PPE that we use. Category 3 PPE includes exclusively the risks that may cause very serious consequences, such as death or irreversible damage to health. Consequences such as death or irreversible damage to health, as consequences go, they don't come much more serious than that. And that's why in Lakeland, our strapline is protect your people. It's what you will see all over our marketing. And we're very aware that were protecting people from workplace hazards that might kill them. So that's the first question. Second question, what are PPE standards for? Good question, you might say. In many cases, they seem to be there to create lots more work for us. But actually, if you think about it, if you accept the premise of the first question, that PPE is there to protect people from hazards that might kill them, the key question is, how do you know your PPE will work? Because that's the role that standards perform. Standards ensure that PPE meet minimum performance requirements. Essentially, they make sure that they will do the job that they should. Because if you don't use PPE that is certified to one standard or another, essentially you have no idea whether it will work or not, whether it will protect or not. And do you really want to be in a position of protecting against those consequences with a guess as to whether the PPE will work? Well, that's what safety standards, what PPE standards do. They provide you with that knowledge, that assurance that it will work. Here's the third question. What are safety managers for? Well, I have to be careful here, obviously, as I've never been a safety manager. But amongst the many, many things that safety managers do, one of them is to select PPE to protect workers from those workplace hazards in specific applications, the specific applications they have in their workplace, to ensure that selected PPE does the job of protection in those specific applications. So when you think about those three things, there's a process there. Basically, you've got PPE that protects people. You've got PPE standards that ensures that that PPE will do the job it should, the job of protection. And safety managers have the job of choosing the PPE for the specific application in their workplace. So we can see there that standards actually play a very important role in that process of choosing garments or any PPE for specific applications. But actually, standards do more than ensure minimum performance very often. Yes, they do supply that knowledge that PPE meets minimum performance requirements and will do the job it should. But also, they very often provide analysis for comparison of different products so that you know how one product compares another, and they provide analysis that enables assessment for your specific application. So if you take those things, those issues, this is my contention about in this presentation, that wherever you are in the world, regardless of what standards apply in your particular region, all standards can play a vital role in ensuring that you select the best protection possible. And I want to show you two examples of that. First of all, protection against hazardous chemicals, and second, protection against flames and heat. And I'm going to look at the various standards for both of these issues, both of these protection requirements in North America, the USA, and in Europe, the CE standards, and compare them and see how both can be used. So let's start with European and North American chemical protective clothing standards and look at how they can both play a role. And we'll start with the CE standards, EN standards for chemical protective clothing. Now, we could talk about these for the rest of the day, so I will try to give you a brief summary, a brief overview, so we can see the point that I'm making. So in Europe, in the EN standards, we essentially have 4 standards that define 5 types of protection against liquids, dusts, and gases. So you see them there, type 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Some of you will immediately notice there's something missing there. There used to be a type 2 originally, but that was withdrawn because, well, nobody understood it and nobody used it anyway. So, but essentially, you've got 5 types of protection relating to liquid, dust, and gas protection. So you have, well, it's not quite as simple as that, but you have an increasing level of protection from type 6. Type 5 is not really a higher level of protection than type 6. Type 5 is dust protection, and it's a different type of protection. Now, in the certification process, to certify a product to any of these standards, there are essentially three types of testing that are conducted. There are tests on the fabric and construction, the strength tests. There is tests on the resistance of permeation or penetration of liquids, and there is the finished garment type testing. Now, the fabric and construction tests, so that's abrasion resistance, tear and tensile strength, and so on, they give you a general profile of the fabric and construction of a garment in terms of its strength properties. The penetration permeation resistance tests, they assess the ability of the fabric to resist either permeation for types 1, 3, and 4, or penetration of liquids for type 6. There's a difference between permeation and penetration, and permeation is very commonly misunderstood, particularly the test that's used in the standards. And you will find lots about that in our blog, our Europe blog. And then finally, the finished garment type test. Now, ironically, these are arguably the most important tests, and yet they are probably the least important, the least understood in the market. But essentially what they involve are real world simulations of environments such as splashes and sprays of liquid, or in the case of dust, a dust-filled environment, to assess how effectively the whole garment protects against that hazard. So if we look at those tests in a slightly different way, the finished garment tests are essentially a pass or fail. That's the test that ensures a minimum performance in a simulated real-world environment. The fabric and construction tests, they are classified 1 to 6, usually with 6 the highest, and they allow comparison of different products, different garments, and assessment for the application. So they are basically answering the questions, which product is the strongest and which is strong enough for my application. And then the penetration and permeation resistance tests, they are similar. They are classified 1 to 6 or 1 to 3, depending on the test, and they allow a comparison and assessment for the application. So essentially they answer the question, will the fabric protect against my chemical? So when you take that sort of big picture view of those tests in the European standards, you realize that they actually are very useful. They define minimum performance requirements so that you know that the suit will do the job it should. They allow comparison of different products in terms of strength and chemical resistance, and they allow assessment of suitability for your specific application. So all in all, those standards are actually very useful in terms of being an assessment tool for safety managers in doing that job of choosing the right chemical suit for the job. So that's the EN standards for chemical protective clothing. Let's look at the US standards. Sorry, excuse me. The US standards. So here is a list of the US standards for chemical protective clothing. Yes, that's right, there aren't any. Isn't that odd? There are actually no US standards in the same way that there are European standards for chemical protective clothing. What there is the organization OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has developed 4 PPE protection levels for hazardous chemical protection. And they take a very different approach to the EN standards. So basically, they address the whole ensemble of PPE required. So not just the coverall, they look at everything that's needed, the suit, the gloves, the masks, the boots, etc. They also prioritize respiratory protection. They see that as the most important, the most dangerous issue, which is arguably is a pretty good approach to take. But they define only general properties of the PPE required. They don't go into any detailed testing of garments or fabrics. So these are those protection levels very briefly. You've got level 4, which is high level respiratory, dermal and optical hazards. You've got level 3, which is again high level respiratory and dermal hazards, but not requiring full gas type protection. Level 2 is limited dermal respiratory hazards, and level 1 is no hazards, really. And you can go into a lot more detail about those, but that's the basics. And again, you've got generally an increasing level of protection. But here's the thing. If we start looking at comparing the N standards and the US standards, in Europe, we can see that we've got a detailed analysis of the performance of the fabric and the garment. But different PPE is dealt with by different standards. So we have to start looking at different standards for different types of PPE, the masks, the gloves, and so on. In USA, the approach is different. In some ways, it's actually complementary, because in the USA, there's no detailed analysis of garments, but it considers all the PPE required, the totality of protection needed. So it's quite easy to see here that we don't need to see these as mutually exclusive. That in the USA, we can use that detailed assessment that's in the EN standards as part of our selection process. And in Europe, we can use those protection levels that OSHA have defined as an indication, a guide to the total protection that's needed for an application. So actually, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, both can play quite a useful role in PPE selection. So that's chemical protection. What about flame and heat protection? Well, I've got less experience with this type of protection, but I've studied the standards. And it's quite interesting because in this case, the usefulness of both is actually even more demonstrative of what I'm talking about. So these are the main standards in Europe and the USA for flame and heat protection. I'm not going to go through them all. Some of you will know these, but one of the things that's worth pointing out immediately, you will see there, is that actually in the USA, there is no standard for garments specifically intended for welding. And that's interesting because immediately you can see, well, that EN standard might be quite useful for users in the USA to think about looking at if they are involved in welding applications. There might be some useful stuff in there. But moving on from that, let's just look at these two standards. These are the two main standards for FR clothing in Europe and in North America. And let's just compare the testing that's done. Again, very quickly, or else we'll be here all day. So there are three types of testing involved, basically. There are others, but these are the main ones. You first got a limited flame spread test. You've got a heat transfer resistant test, so tests, and you've got a thermal mannequin test. So the limited flame test is a very simple test. Basically, you apply a flame to a sample of fabric, either the center or the bottom edge, and that is basically a pass or fail test, and it assesses the flammability of the material. It's basically making sure that the garment, the fabric, doesn't continue to burn and therefore make burn injury worse. And that test is in both CE and US standard. What about and there are minor differences in that, very similar in both cases. The heat transfer resistance test is a very useful test. Basically, you have a heat source, which might be an electric bar fire, for example. You have a sample of the fabric, and then you have a heat sensor at the other side. And essentially, you are measuring how effectively the fabric blocks the transfer of heat energy to the body of the wearer, because it's the heat energy, the rate and the amount of heat energy that will cause a burn. So it's how effectively the fabric slows that down and blocks it. And again, there's tests like that in CE and in the US, but there are quite major differences in those tests, which we'll look at in a moment. And then you have the thermal mannequin test, very useful test, which, like the type tests in chemical protection, simulates a flash fire on the whole garment, the full garment, not just the fabric, but the whole thing. And it predicts body burn and where body burn would be. So it's assessing the performance of the whole garment. And again, that test is in CE and it's in the US, but there are important differences there. So let's leave aside the limited flame spread test because they are very similar in both standards. And let's look at the other two because that's where the differences are that we can exploit. So first of all, in the USA, when we're thinking about the heat transfer resistance tests, it's only one test. It's ASTM 2700 heat transfer performance. And basically, you apply a frame underneath a piece of fabric, and there's a heat sensor, and it's measuring the resistance of heat energy transfer. And in that test, it's pass or fail with minimum performance requirements. However, in Europe, we've got 5 optional tests, 5 different tests measuring heat resistance, or the resistance to transfer of heat energy, because there are different ways that heat energy can transfer. So you've got convective heat, you've got radiant heat, so you've got contact heat, and you've also got 2 tests for aluminium and iron, molten aluminium and iron splash. So you've got 5 optional tests there, and each of those tests, the results are classified as 3 or 4 performance levels, depending on the test. So you're able to analyze garments, fabric, in terms of the performance against specific types of heat energy transfer. It's worth pointing out here that they are optional, but in the standard, you must do at least 1 and get a minimum class 1 performance. But you could do 1, or you could do all 5, or you could select 3 according to what your application or what the garment is intended to do. It's worth pointing out here that the convective heat test in EN is very similar to the test that's used in the US. But as I say, in Europe, we've got this selection of 5 different tests for specific types of heat energy. So let's just briefly look as well at the thermal mannequin test. This is a really useful test. As I said, it simulates a garment to a simulated flash fire, and it produces a prediction of body burn. Very useful. So in the US, this test is compulsory. You have to do it, and it defines specific test parameters and the minimum performance requirements. But in Europe, it's an optional test. You don't have to do it. There are no specific test parameters, so you could choose those yourself, which means that if you're comparing garments, you've got to make sure you're comparing tests with the same parameters, and there's no minimum performance requirements. It's for comparative purposes only, and it's optional. And that's the key thing, compulsory versus optional. So where does that leave us in terms of making use of both these types of tests? Well, clearly, if we use the heat transfer resistance and the thermal mannequin test that we've just talked about, it's a similar situation to what we saw in chemical protection. In the USA, it might be useful to use those different heat energy transfer tests to assess specific performance for specific applications. And in Europe, we should certainly take the lead from the Americans and only use garments that have been tested to that thermal mannequin test to prove how effective it is, and according to specific parameters for the test. So again, like with chemical, you can see that we don't need to see US tests and European tests as mutually exclusive. We can use both and take the best of both for the assessment of garments for our specific application. So we've looked there at 2 examples of using both US and EN standards for, first of all, chemical protection, protective clothing, in which we saw that the OSHA guidance can provide a good, useful information on the totality of protection needed. The EN standards provide a very useful analysis of minimum performance and comparative performance. So both have their place in selection of chemical protective clothing. Similarly, in flame and heat protection, we saw, first of all, that, well, the EN has a welding standard, which might be useful to the US because they don't have one. But again, the EN transfer tests, heat transfer tests in Europe, might be useful for US users. And the thermal mannequin test, when it comes to that, well, in Europe, we should follow the lead of the Americans and make sure we're using garments that have been thermal mannequin tested to prove how effective they are. So hopefully you've seen the point that I'm making there about using both or all standards. They can all play a role. So I want to draw that to a conclusion by thinking about this new approach and how this new approach can change the PPE business. To do that, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. The first one is this. what's the general attitude in the market to PPE standards? Well, I think there's two options to this. Basically, A, that people generally see them as we talked about, useful tools for assessing performance, to select the best PPE for the job, or B, legal or a market-led requirement sometimes that has to be met. Just a box we have to tick, something we have to do. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've been involved in chemical protective clothing for 30 years. And my feeling, my impression gained over that time is largely this, that many people in the market just see standards as something that has to be done, a box we have to tick. So this presentation is really a call. It's trying to encourage people to change that and look at standards differently and look at standards as useful tools to make sure that you're getting the best protection for the workers that you can. And finally, I mentioned another question. So my final question is this: what will be my dying words? Now, I don't know, of course, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about my life. Not a lot, don't get too excited, but ever since I was pretty small, I've enjoyed doing a bit of DIY at home, you know, putting up shelves and making cupboards and all sorts of things. And I've done it for the last 40 years. I love it. I find it relaxing and therapeutic, and more to the point, it's a lot cheaper than paying someone else to do it. So for the last 40 years, until very recently, I've used one of these, or several of them. I've got a whole collection of these at home. The Philips one is very useful, the slotted one less so. And I've been quite happy using this until about a year ago. And then on a whim, I bought myself one of these about 12 months ago. And within 5 minutes of using it, I thought, why on earth didn't I buy one of these 20 years ago? It would have saved me so much time. So you might be wondering what the point is of this. Well, think about all those standards around the world: NFPA, STM, OSHA, CE, ISO, with all different tests. Well, if you focus on just one of those types of standards, because that happens to be the one that applies where you are, you might be missing out. You might be missing out on a particular test or some information that's in one of those other standards that you've never looked at because you don't have to. But there might be something there that's the equivalent of my electronic screwdriver that gives you a better tool for selecting PPE, because at the end of the day, better selection tools means better PPE selection, which then means better protection. And ultimately, that saves lives. So if you think about standards in these terms, you would have to ask this question of yourself: why on earth would you choose to use only one region's standards when there's a whole wealth of useful tools out there in other standards that you've never looked at? So that's basically the end of the presentation. I hope that was interesting and useful. Of course, if you don't want to take that view of standards and start using them as tools rather than as just something that you have to abide by, you wouldn't want to talk to the experts, of course. And when it comes to chemical protection, there are no greater experts than Lakeland. We've been designing, developing, making chemical protective clothing for over 40 years. And one of the things I would recommend is that you subscribe to our blog, our European blog. You will find a whole wealth of articles and information on chemical protection and FR protection. For example, the recent one, we actually compared the end clothing types with the OSHA protection levels in detail. There's another one there, 8 key features to look for in your chemical suit. That's the address of the blog. Go and register. You'll get regular updates on new articles. And as I say, there's something like 50 or 60 articles in there now about chemical and flame and heat protection. And finally, please do look for me on LinkedIn and connect with me. I'm regularly posting links to articles or posting articles on there. I like to do little videos about things, and I try to make them a little bit entertaining as well. So do find me on LinkedIn and connect with me. I'll be very pleased to hear from you with any comments or questions you have. So that concludes the presentation.